Welcome to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. The French Revolution is considered one of the most consequential events in the history of civilization. An unlikely young lawyer from a small French town in the provinces, Maximilien Robespierre, is considered by many as the catalyst of that monumental movement. Robespierre played a critical role in igniting the revolution and in steering that movement over the next few years. During the time, he gained a reputation for demanding equality and justice for France's common people. But he's also been accused of the man responsible for thousands of executions, which he maintained was necessary for the revolution to be successful. Today, we have Peter McPhee with us to take a look at this highly controversial figure in history. Peter is Professor Emeritus at the University of Melbourne and author of Robespierre, A Revolutionary Life, along with several other works about the French Revolution. So, Peter, welcome to Outrageous History, and thanks for being here today.
It's very nice to be with you all the way from Australia.
Peter, the French Revolution upset French politics, culture, and life, and had an immense influence globally. Can you tell us what led to this major event and why an unknown local lawyer had such a critical role?
Well, the immediate cause of the French Revolution actually was all about state finances, because France had been involved on the side of the colonists during the American War of Independence. They ended that war in 1779, and France's involvement in the War of Independence was ultimately decisive in the victory of the new United States of America. But that created massive financial problems because of the costs of the war in France. A monarchy that was already struggling with what we would today call sovereign debt, and the costs of fighting that war on the side of the Americans exacerbated that problem. So Louis XVI called a meeting of representatives of the various strata of society, a meeting that hadn't been held for a century and three quarters, 175 years, because the kings of France, in theory, were absolute in their power. But he called an advisory meeting, which got out of hand. He mismanaged it, and that was the immediate cause of the revolution. Having said that, we need also to understand that there was much wider dissatisfaction of an intellectual, cultural type. This was the period, after all, of the Enlightenment. The same concepts of popular sovereignty, of individual human rights and so on that were intrinsic to the American War of Independence were also there in French society in the second half of the 18th century. There was increasing criticism of a political and social hierarchy, which was based on the privilege that pertained to the Catholic Church and to the nobility, the absolute power of the king, and so on. So there were much wider intellectual political currents at play, and these were unleashed in 1789 when Louis XVI called that meeting, that advisory meeting of what we call the Estates General. Now, Robespierre, as you say, this young lawyer, just 31 years old, he was elected as one of the third estate or commoner deputies to the Estates General. He was a very talented young lawyer, a very clever young man, but he was smouldering away in his small northern French town of Arras, resenting the social mores which excluded him from being at the pinnacle of that society. And really the calling of the Estates General, the chance to become involved in national politics, was a wonderful opportunity for him. So, like scores of thousands of similar people across the kingdom, he became very involved, enthusiastically involved in the discussions, the elections that led up to 1789. It gave him an opportunity which was undreamt of beforehand to be involved in national political decisions.
So, as the revolution gradually evolved and as it started to take control of that country, how much control of France do you feel that Robespierre was actually able to exercise at the height of his power? I mean, did he personally have that kind of control, which enabled the terror that took place in the latter stages of the revolution.
It's important to remember, of course, that Robespierre was only actually in government for 1 year, from July 1793 to July 1794. But of course, that's the most controversial, volatile period of the French Revolution, the one that people look back on afterwards and said, well, that was the reign of terror. He'd not been in government until that point. He was an oppositional politician. It's difficult for us to conceptualize, however, Ernest, just how little direct control that French revolutionary governments were able to exercise over the entire nation, because we're talking about the largest country in Western Europe at a time of very rudimentary communications. I mean, people were only just starting to experiment with the telegraph, so that any news and information reports that went out from Paris would take 2 or 3 weeks to reach many parts of the country. This was a pre-industrial society in terms of communication. So even when Robespierre came to be part of the government as part of what was called the Committee of Public Safety at the most critical period of the revolution, the direct control that revolutionary governments were able to exercise over the citizenry was nothing like governments can exercise today. We also need to remember that Robespierre was one of 12 elected members of a wartime government. This Committee of Public Safety was composed of 12 individuals elected from the Parliament, or the National Convention, as it was called. They were elected a month at a time. They had to have their mandates renewed. This was like an emergency wartime cabinet, and Robespierre was only one of 12 members of that. He was perhaps the best known because he was the person that made the big statements, the big speeches, whereas there were other members of that committee who were specialists in organising supplies, military strategy, those sorts of things. But he was the man who was looked up to as the person who was particularly able to articulate the big strategic statements.
Well, take us through some of those stages of the revolution, because there were a number of different stages, and they included the potential war, which was a major factor.
The most significant turning point of the French Revolution is in April 1792, when France goes to war with Austria, and a couple of months later with Prussia. It's a crucial turning point because until that time, there were people were often divided about the way that the new France should be, but they were differences of opinion. Once war breaks out, those divisions become matters of life and death. They become deadly divisions. So the war from April 1792 really becomes the overwhelming factor in the evolution of the French Revolution. Louis XVI, along with Marie Antoinette, is widely believed to be in league with the enemy. And that's why just a few months after war is declared, he's overthrown, a republic is proclaimed, Louis is put in trial and ultimately executed as a traitor. That effectively brings the rest of Europe into the war. I mean, by early in 1793, France is fighting a war against Britain, Spain, the Italian states, Austria and Prussia. It has very few allies. The United States is one of them. And there's also armed counter-revolution in several regions of the country. That's the point in the spring of 1793, where the democratically elected Parliament or National Convention says the only way through this is to appoint a Committee of Public Safety, an emergency government, to take whatever measures are necessary to see if we can save the revolution, save France itself. Robespierre is elected to that body in July 1793, and they are given sweeping powers, to draconian powers, emergency powers to try and save the revolution, save the country. They do, but at enormous cost in human life.
Now, at the same time that you mentioned as well the counter-revolutionary action that was taking place. So at the same time as this threat of war and as the war actually took place, there was so much disagreement going on between all the various movements in that country?
One of the fundamental divisions, Ernest, is around the place of the church in French society. I mean, before the revolution, the Catholic Church was the only authorized church. It was dominated in its elite positions, the bishops, archbishops, and so on, by members of the nobility. And it's a privileged order of society. It levies its own taxes voluntarily as a gift to the king. It has all sorts of privileges. It's almost a state within a state. Now, in 1789, the revolution prepares very significant reforms to the church. It nationalises church property. It improves the financial position of ordinary parish priests. It seeks to do away with privilege within the church. But the reforms it introduces are profoundly controversial. For example, it introduces the principle of election of parish priests, which of course directly flies in the face of Catholic teaching about ecclesiastical authority ultimately descending from God. Now, the Catholic Church is ripped apart by those reforms. There are many parish priests, perhaps half of them, who support the revolution, who support those changes, who can live with those changes. But in many parts of the country, people are outraged. The Pope condemns the French Revolution. So that's a really fundamental division at the heart of French society. As I said, once war is declared in 1792, those divisions within the church become deadly, because any of the priests who are opposed to the church effectively are expected to leave the country, because they're seen to be in league with the foreign coalition that's trying to destroy the revolution.
And the movement against aristocratic privileges was also a huge part of that changeover.
Well, a fundamental principle of the French Revolution is that people should be equal in terms of rights and responsibilities. The French Revolution is very much a revolution against what we would call institutionalized privilege. That is, privilege that belongs to particular groups of people because of who they are. So the nobility, like the clergy, have privileges that belong to them as a body corporate. They have their own legal systems. They have their own taxation exemptions and so on. They dominate the elite positions in French society. So from day one, the French Revolution is driven by an attack on institutionalized privilege. The whole basis of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, that key revolutionary document from 1789, is that people are born free and equal in the eyes of the law and have equal rights and responsibilities. The nobility certainly are the big losers in that sense, because they have to confront a world where all positions in French society are now opened up to people of talent. There are no more exclusive positions. They lose ultimately all of their feudal privileges. So the great victory of the French peasantry in the French Revolution is the end of the old feudal or seigneurial system. The nobility loses its tax exemptions. So many, if not all, of the old nobility are profoundly hostile to the revolution.
And Robespierre seemed to have, or he seemed to speak for the common people, or he felt that was his position for speaking for the peasants, something that he gained through his childhood and through his education.
Oh, sure. I mean, Robespierre comes from a middle-class family. I mean, a family of lawyers, although his own mother is the daughter of a brewer, a beer maker in the town of Arras. He has a controversial origin in that he's conceived outside wedlock. There's something of a scandal around the family, although certainly it seems as though his parents were very much in love. They went on to marry and have many other children. But he is someone who is always slightly on the margins of polite society, not only because of the family scandal, but because, after all, he's a middle-class lawyer in a town that's dominated by the church and the nobility. And it rankles with him that he's obviously a highly intelligent. He was a brilliant scholarship boy at the best school in France, and yet he's looked down upon by the well-to-do in his society. He identifies with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen almost as if it was some secular version of the Ten Commandments. I mean, the 17 articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, he assumes to be immutable statements about the way the world ought to be in terms of equal rights and responsibilities, equal dignity before the law, equal status of all citizens. So he becomes seen very early on in the revolution as somehow personifying the highest ideals of what the revolution was supposed to be about. His nickname, which he earns in the first year or two in Paris, is the Incorruptible, because Robespierre is seen to be someone who's not interested in power for its own sake or in making a lot of money or doing favours, doing deals. He believes in the implementation of the rights of man without compromise, and he's not for sale. And so he develops a very strong following in Paris and elsewhere as a politician you can trust, as the Incorruptible.
I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about his personality, his ambition, his drive, his discipline, his absolute devotion to his principles, as you're just pointing out. But then, as you mentioned in your book, he's also been criticized as having an obsessive personality, which eventually led to that reign of terror during those particular years. I mean, was he any different from any other complicated players during that time?
One of the most important things we need to realize about Robespierre is that when he is overthrown in July 1794, there is an extraordinary weight that is put on creating a negative memory, a negative stereotype about this person. In 1793, 1794, at the height of that military crisis, of military invasion, of civil war and so on, there's terrible suffering in many parts of the country. This is a time of great loss of life. It's true also that during that year, there are events that we would today call atrocities that are committed. And once Robespierre is overthrown in July 1794, when the war is won, when the crisis has been overcome, what people tend to do is to lay the blame for anything on Robespierre himself, as if he had had almost supernatural powers. He's a classic example of someone who is burdened from hindsight with all sorts of things for which he was not responsible. In terms of his personality, people imagine a whole series of stereotypes around him. I mean, I found him to be a passionate young man who's completely committed to these revolutionary principles, very serious, to be sure, but someone who certainly had close friendships, particularly with women. But this idea of Robespierre as this sort of icy dictator, devoid of ordinary human sentiment, sending people off to their deaths in the guillotine, that's far removed from reality. Robespierre never had the power to order guillotinings. He was a member of the government. All he could do, like any other member of that government, was ask the police to investigate someone. But ultimately, it was a court that put people on trial and decided whether they were guilty or not. But it was much easier in hindsight to blame Robespierre for anything that people felt uncomfortable about.
Now, you made some interesting points about his formal education, and you know, he did, I don't know, hundreds of speeches, and numerous amounts of correspondence during that short period of time. In deriving some of his principles, you mentioned that much of his formal education focused on the ancient Greeks and Romans and the philosophers of that time, but he was also a great admirer of Rousseau. So who do you think had the greatest influence?
Oh, that's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question. We need to remember that in the 18th century, that it was almost exclusively boys who went to secondary school. The vast majority of children only did primary school, if at all. It tended to be very clever young boys of the middle classes who went onto secondary school, and the curriculum was dominated by study of the classics. A lot of the teaching was done in Latin. Robespierre was a scholarship boy who made it to the top secondary school in France, the Lycée Louis le Grand, just over the road from the Sorbonne. It's still there, still a great school in Paris. And that's where his years as a high school student were imbued with the readings of tales from the classics about the great figures of classical antiquity. If you read Robespierre's speeches, and he made 900 of them during the French Revolution, if you read his speeches, if you read the speeches of his contemporaries, they're laced with references to figures from classical antiquity that we today find mystifying. I mean, we haven't heard of these people, but this was the language that they were familiar with. It was enough for them to refer to the military triumphs of King Ajax for everybody in the parliament to nod their heads and know exactly what was being referred to, because they'd all had the same syllabus at high school. But I think that Robespierre, even more importantly than that, is influenced by the great Enlightenment thinkers of the time, particularly Rousseau, who he claimed to have met, but we're not sure. Those fundamental principles of the Enlightenment and their political and social application, the idea of the social contract, of equality before the law, of the rights of individuals and so on. These were the ideals that really inspired him directly. So I think that the references that he constantly made to the world of classical antiquity is more by way of inspiration, to give examples. It's more to, we would say, claim authority by being able to refer to the classical world. But I think in terms of his core values, he's most influenced, like other educated bourgeois boys like him, by the world of the Enlightenment.
During the latter stages of the revolution, there was constant turmoil, let's say between the fall of 1793. The suspension was actually suspended at that time, I believe. And then after Robespierre's execution in July of 1794, I mean, the Constitution was suspended in the fall. Yeah. There seemed to be so much infighting between the various groups. There were apparent betrayals between those groups and individuals. Could there be any hope that the revolution would actually lead to a stable, successful nation?
The great issue, once the revolutionary government of the Committee of Public Safety is put in place in 1793, the great issue is, what measures does it need to take in order to secure victory? The Constitution, as you say, is suspended. It's revolutionary government until peace is achieved. Now, of course, the number one issue then becomes, how do we know when we've won? What is the point at which we can say it's now safe to go back to the Constitution, that we now have a stable military situation? By the middle of 1794, French revolutionary armies are winning battle after battle, particularly in the northeast of France, along today what we would call the Belgian and German borders, where they're defeating Austrian and Prussian armies. The military situation is improving. And certainly there are influential people who are saying, stop this revolutionary government, stop these measures of terror against counter-revolutionaries and so on. The revolution is now safe. Robespierre disagrees, but that issue becomes the critical one. And I guess from our point of view, we could look back and say, if Robespierre had supported the winding down of revolutionary government a month earlier, he'd now be regarded as one of the great figures of French history. But the fact that he wants it to continue on becomes his undoing in the end. Certainly, France emerges triumphant in the sense that the revolution is victorious, the country is made safe, but the political divisions, the social divisions from the French Revolution are so deep in French society that you could argue that it's not for almost 100 years that there is some sort of general agreement in France about a republican government being the ideal form of government. France emerges from the revolution a different type of society, but one that's very, very divided.
Can you give us some examples of what happened during the Reign of Terror? I mean, it has the image. Definitely that's what we think of. What actually happened during that time that produced that kind of image?
One of the measures that's taken is that anybody who's denounced by a local watch committee or surveillance committee in a village or a town can be detained as a suspect. There are about 80,000 of those people in a country of 28 million. And some of those people are put on trial. In terms of deaths, it's estimated that the number of people who are put on trial as counter-revolutionaries and executed is around 30,000 in that year. In other words, compared to some of the modern periods of repression, it's not as bloodthirsty as those, but it's still horrible. It's still about 8 times the death rate on our roads. What's even more shocking is that even though most of the people who are put on trial and executed as counter-revolutionaries are tried for having taken up arms against the government, they can be tried as armed counter-revolutionaries. An increasing number of people are put on trial and judged according to their counter-revolutionary words and lobbying. They're put on trial for their opinions, in other words, and that's what's particularly shocking in a society where just a few years earlier, the Declaration of the Rights of Man had said everybody has the right to freedom of speech and expression of their views and all the rest of it. So there are certainly a significant number of people who are put on trial and executed. There are occasional atrocities, particularly in the west of France, where there is a counter-revolutionary insurrection, and the civil war that occurs there as that insurrection is repressed leads to a total of maybe 200,000 deaths in that fighting. And it leaves scars in Western France, which are still there today in terms of people's attitudes and their politics and so on. So this is a period of victory or death, as people at the time say. It's a war to the death, and the loss in human life is staggering. Robespierre himself is not someone who has the authority to order those deaths, as I said, but it becomes very convenient afterwards to blame him for anything that's been excessive.
So the burden of the Reign of Terror has been placed on his shoulders, and his demise was particularly tragic. Ironically, he was elected president of the National Convention in June of 1794, and then a month later, by July, at another meeting of the convention, there were calls for his execution. Can you describe what happened at that meeting, and then how he met his end?
This is the pinnacle, June, July 1794, of the debate about whether this period of of revolutionary government that from hindsight is called the Reign of Terror. It's not called the Reign of Terror at the time. But the big debate is whether the military successes of the revolutionary armies would enable that revolutionary government to be scaled down for France to return to constitutional government. As I say, if Robespierre early in June 1794 had said, let's talk about ending revolutionary government, he'd now be regarded as one of the great heroes of French history, in my opinion. There's great debate about what goes on. I mean, my own view is that he is suffering increasingly from physical and mental exhaustion. I think he loses his capacity to make clear-headed judgment, so that when he goes to the National Convention in late July 1794, and he's been absent for about 6 weeks, whether or not he's been very sick, I think he had been very sick. Others disagree. But he goes to the convention and makes a long, rambling and threatening speech where he says there are still guilty people who need to be punished, and some of them are sitting here in the National Parliament. He doesn't name names, even though people ask him to. He just says the guilty people know who they are and they must face justice. And he seems to be accusing people who had been responsible in person for some of the atrocities. But of course, making a vague speech like that simply gives advance warning to all of those people. And they spend that night planning the overthrow of Robespierre the next day, which they do. And he's then sentenced to be arrested and ultimately caught and executed. During that period, Robespierre is both the most loved and respected politician in the country and the most hated one, because in some ways he personifies the values, the passion, the dream of the French Revolution, which for many people has become a nightmare. So Robespierre is both adored because he's seen to represent the vision of what the new France could be. At the same time, because he's so uncompromising, people burden him with all of their hatred. He's also loathed by many people.
So can you put the revolution and the Republic into perspective as it's affected not only France, but other countries throughout the world?
We shouldn't let the images that are so popular and powerful of terror, we shouldn't let those hide us from the sense in which the French Revolution is one of the most successful revolutions in history. And by that I mean that it embeds in French society certain fundamental changes, such as the end of absolute monarchy and instead the rule of constitutional parliamentary government. It represents the idea of equality before the law, of one set of rights and responsibilities, whatever your social background. For rural people, it represents the end of the feudal regime. The French Revolution represents the end of slavery in French colonies. There are all sorts of really fundamental changes that the French Revolution introduces, which no government was ever able to overturn, even though some of them tried to. It's also a revolution which resonates through much of the rest of the world, so that historians today spend more and more time looking at the international repercussions of the revolution across the Atlantic, in North and South America, across the Mediterranean, even in parts of India and Asia. This is a revolution with international repercussions. But we need to understand those repercussions as a two-way process, so that when the news of the French Revolution, for example, reaches Egypt, people interpret the French Revolution through the lens of Egyptian circumstances. There's a dialogue between local circumstances and the news from France. So the French Revolution has this complicated set of repercussions across the world, but the more we understand about it, the more we're staggered by the extent to which various parts of the world are influenced by those big questions about the French Revolution. What is the meaning of liberty? What is the meaning of equality in practice? How can liberty and equality be reconciled? What does it mean in particular local circumstances? The French Revolution is profoundly revolutionary in France, but it also has dramatic repercussions elsewhere.
And which are still taking place today, which can be related back to that period.
Yes, one dramatic example of that is when we think of the massacre on Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989, when it was a very dramatic moment because there were some Chinese students on that square before the massacre holding up placards about "We want our 1789."
Oh my gosh!
This was 1989, and that was also the moment of the bicentenary of the revolution in Paris. I was in Paris at the time, and there was this extraordinary juxtaposition of people in France commemorating the bicentenary of the French Revolution and what it stood for at the very time when there's a revolutionary crisis in China.
Oh my gosh, that is so ironic that it is still viewed that way during our troubled times.
Yes.
Well, Peter, I do thank you so much for taking us through this complicated but crucial period of history.
It's been my pleasure, Ernest. Thank you.
And I thank all of you for tuning into Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson, and we'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.